What happens when brilliance comes wrapped in fury? When the charm curdles, the smile fades, and the cameras keep rolling. These 13 legendary British stars lit up screens with their talent and burned down sets with their tempers. From icy put-downs to backstage wars, they weren't just difficult, they were unforgettable. Welcome to the darker side of old-school fame, where genius met chaos, and no one escaped unscathed. Before we dive in, if you love deep dives into the strange, the scandalous, and the stories hiding in plain sight, go ahead and subscribe. It helps more than you know. And while you're here, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Are you up late with tea, or way too early with regrets? 1. Oliver Reed. There's a particular kind of British actor that Hollywood used to adore, the kind who could terrify a publicist, charm a barman, and punch a cameraman all before breakfast. Oliver Reed was that kind. Distilled. A heavy-lidded storm cloud in human form, Reed's reputation wasn't just about his acting, it was about the threat of him. The sense that, at any moment, the charming rogue might unscrew his own head and throw it at you. In the 1960s and 70s, when dangerous masculinity could still be sold like cologne, Reed became a sort of cultural grenade with a pint glass in place of the pin. On talk shows, he slurred and snarled. In bars, he bled and swaggered. In interviews, you could see hosts physically tense, waiting for him to cross the invisible line between chaotic energy and actual violence. One famously ended with the producer cutting away before Reed could escalate his drunken threats into a real-time disaster. It was theater, but with real-world casualties. He wasn't just drinking. He was performing rage raw, unrehearsed, and sometimes genuinely frightening. His face, famously scarred from a bar fight, became a kind of proof of life for his legend. Reed didn't just have a temper, he weaponized it. It was both his marketing tool and his sabotage switch. And people loved him for it. Until they didn't. Behind the scenes, the mythology thickens. Crew members allegedly refused to work with him. Some called him a liability, others a ticking time bomb in a velvet jacket. But for every story of someone quitting a set, there's another of a producer excusing his behavior as just Ollie being Ollie. In the age of the lovable Hellraiser, Reed was a commercial asset dangerous enough to seem sexy, but just controllable enough to roll cameras, usually. His death in a bar in Malta, reportedly after besting a group of sailors in a drinking contest, felt disturbingly on brand. Like the curtain call of a man who could only exist at the edge of his own self-destruction. He was a hammer cast as a leading man, and no one ever quite knew who was going to get hit next. Sometimes, it was Elizabeth Taylor. 2. Richard Burton. Richard Burton didn't explode like Reed. He simmered, then boiled, then shattered the teacup. If Oliver Reed was a pub brawl in human form, Burton was a Shakespearean monologue whispered through gritted teeth, beautiful, bitter, and often a few drinks too deep. Born with the voice of a demigod and the liver of a doomed poet, Burton came to embody the tortured British genius. Literate, magnetic, and dangerously combustible. His temper wasn't just famous, it was public property, especially once Elizabeth Taylor entered the frame. The two of them didn't fight behind closed doors. They fought in headlines, in front of cameras, in hotel lobbies and press junkets. They were a paparazzi dream and a director's nightmare. One oft-quoted line from Taylor, repeated across decades, paints the picture plainly. Burton, she said, could be the kindest man in the world, until he wasn't. He didn't break furniture. He broke atmospheres. The energy in a room could drop 10 degrees when he entered drunk and brooding. The crew would brace themselves. The boom operator would hold his breath. It wasn't just the drink, though. The drink rarely helped. It was something deeper. A fury at the absurdity of fame, a contempt for mediocrity, and a kind of Welsh theatrical pride that made compromise feel like humiliation. Directors described screaming matches as though they were weather events, unpredictable, inevitable, and survivable only if you didn't make eye contact. But here's the twist. Burton's outbursts were often forgiven, brushed off as brilliance leaking out sideways. He was seen as one half of a volatile masterpiece, the mad painter, the scorned poet in a Savile Row suit. He acted angry so convincingly that people assumed the real anger must be part of the craft. Or worse, part of the price. Still, the myth always came at a cost. Relationships burned, scripts derailed. By the end, the public loved the idea of Burton more than the man himself, and he knew it, which only made him angrier. But if you thought Rex Harrison would be easier to work with, well, welcome to the next nightmare. If you're still with us after Burton's beautifully controlled detonation, you're exactly our kind of viewer. Go ahead and subscribe, we've got plenty more legends with egos bigger than their trailers. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Midnight in Manchester? Sunrise in Sydney? We're dying to know who's sharing this descent into vintage chaos with us. 3. Rex Harrison. Rex Harrison didn't throw punches. He didn't storm off sets. He didn't even raise his voice much. No, Rex preferred to dismantle your soul with surgical precision. If Oliver Reed was a fire, and Burton a landslide, Harrison was a scalpel cold, sharp, and always just one insult away from drawing metaphorical blood. By the time he swaggered into My Fair Lady, Harrison had already cemented his reputation as one of the most arrogant and difficult stars in British entertainment. Cast and crew alike came to expect a daily ration of verbal cruelty, often dressed up in that clipped, upper-crust cadence that made the insults sting even harder. He didn't scream, he dismissed. You didn't just get yelled at, you got made to feel beneath contempt. Actors who worked with him often reported the same thing. Rex would hit his mark, say his lines, and then spend the rest of the shoot making everyone else feel like amateurs. It wasn't ego so much as entitlement, the belief that his talent gave him the right to be unbearable, and for a long time, the system agreed with him. Tales from his film sets are riddled with little rebellions, crews pinning his costumes in irritating ways, quiet revenge plots whispered in trailers. But Harrison, true to form, always seemed unbothered. He didn't care if you hated him. He assumed you did. That was your problem. Of course, this wasn't limited to behind-the-scenes sabotage. Journalists tried to get him to open up, only to be met with theatrical boredom or condescension. He gave the impression that he was doing the world a favor by merely showing up, and in some ways, he was. Audiences adored him. Critics called him magnetic. Directors, when asked how they managed his temperament, often sighed and said things like, "He's Rex, what can you do?" The answer was, nothing. You tolerated it. Because in the Hollywood of his time, being a brilliant, difficult man wasn't a liability, it was practically a job requirement. Which brings us to a man who didn't just speak cutting lines, he threw them, sometimes along with a punch. Welcome to the volcanic wrath of Nicol Williamson. 4. Nicol Williamson. If you've never heard of Nicol Williamson, that's partly because he made it difficult to keep him hired. A fire starter of Shakespearean proportions, Williamson wasn't just mercurial, he was cataclysmic. A brilliant actor with an instinct for combustion, he left a trail of scorched earth across every stage and soundstage he touched. He was Arthur in Excalibur, Hamlet on film, and reportedly, a nightmare in any dressing room within shouting distance. The stories about Nicol are not merely whispered among theater nerds, they're documented, printed in obituaries, and repeated like war stories in memoirs and interviews. Unlike the typical diva drama, his outbursts weren't petty, they were seismic. He punched producer David Merrick, not metaphorically, not emotionally, literally, and then kept working. In curtain calls, he sometimes lashed out at co-stars. During performances, he'd rewrite the rhythm of a scene on the fly, not because it was better, but because he felt like it. Co-stars would speak about him in the way you might talk about a wild animal you once shared a tent with, grudging respect, mixed with visible trauma. Alcohol, of course, played a role it always does in these stories. But with Williamson, it wasn't just the drink. It was an unwillingness to filter anything. His rage was raw, unedited, and inescapably public. He didn't try to hide it. He didn't even seem to believe he should. To Nicol, the theater was war, and everyone else was either an obstacle or an audience. And yet the performances, Hamlet, Little Murders, Excalibur, he wasn't merely good. He was spellbinding. You couldn't take your eyes off him. Directors put up with the behavior because, in front of the camera, he was a different kind of explosive, the kind that lit up the whole screen. Eventually, though, The industry did what it always does, with volatile talent that stops making money. It stopped answering his calls. He became a cautionary tale, a what might have been, in the footnotes of British acting history. But if Nicol was a warning siren, the next man was a shape-shifting landmine, a comic genius whose temper arrived with a different punchline. His name? Peter Sellers. 5. Peter Sellers. Peter Sellers was a man of many faces, quite literally. He played bumbling detectives, mad scientists, clueless aristocrats, and clueless clergymen. He slipped into accents and identities the way most people slip into socks. But when the cameras stopped rolling, Sellers often became a black hole of charm, unknowable, unpredictable, and, more often than not, unpleasant. People who knew him well would say he vanished between roles. What remained was a man shaped by insecurity and lightning-fast mood swings. Directors never knew whether they were getting Peter the professional or Peter the petulant. On a good day, he could be dazzling. On a bad one, he could derail an entire production with a pout, a rage spiral, or a cold refusal to speak. It's not hard to find reports of Sellers threatening to walk off projects mid-shoot. In fact, it became something of a trademark. If a scene didn't go his way, if he felt disrespected, bored, or simply not in the mood, he would sulk, vanish, or launch into a tirade. Producers scrambled. Co-stars clenched their jaws, budgets stretched, and somehow, again and again, he was forgiven. Because Sellers wasn't just good, he was box office. Even when he was tormenting directors with wild improvisations or refusing to come out of his trailer, the industry made room for him. It helped that he could, when he wanted to, flip the switch and deliver something uncanny, a line reading no one expected, a gesture that lingered in the mind long after the credits rolled. But that same genius made him nearly impossible to live with. Britt Ekland, his second wife, described a relationship that veered into possessiveness and emotional volatility. His friends spoke of mood swings that could end an evening or a friendship with a single look. It was as though Sellers was allergic to consistency, even his own personality. And yet, he endured. Even as his health declined and his behavior grew more erratic, Hollywood kept calling, maybe because no one else could do what he did. Or maybe because chaos, once wrapped in a funny accent, still sold tickets. But not all tempers come in disguise. Some, like Sean Connery's, were as blunt and unapologetic as the man himself. 6. Sean Connery. Sean Connery didn't need to throw tantrums. He was the tantrum. Not the loud, theatrical kind, the cold, stone-faced kind that made entire rooms go silent. He carried a kind of menace, not in volume, but in presence. Connery could make a co-star sweat just by narrowing his eyes, and if he didn't like the way a shoot was going, you didn't hear about it. You felt it, like a pressure system dropping. He was a product of two eras, the rough-hewn masculinity of post-war Britain, and the global superstardom of 1960s Hollywood. He hated pretense, distrusted producers, and reportedly loathed being handled. Connery didn't believe in star treatment unless he was the one delivering it. Stories circulated of clashes with directors, late career friction with younger co-stars, and long grudges held over script decisions. On paper, these could be read as creative differences. In practice, they were storm systems that hovered over set until someone gave in. His reputation for having a temper wasn't tabloid fluff, it was baked into how studios approached him. Handle with care, speak plainly, don't waste his time. What really tarnished Connery's legacy, though, wasn't something from a movie set, it was his own words. In interviews from the 1960s, and again in later decades, Connery made deeply troubling comments about hitting women if they deserved it. These weren't off-the-cuff remarks. They were clear, unflinching statements, and they followed him for the rest of his life. Some tried to chalk it up to a generational mindset. Others didn't excuse it at all. Yet, despite the controversy, Connery's career barely flinched. He remained a bankable star into his 60 seconds, draped in Oscars and franchise deals. The Bond brand helped audiences had long been conditioned to equate his off-screen toughness with on-screen cool. And in an era that still lionized strong, silent types, Connery's stoicism was seen as admirable, even when it bordered on hostility. But while Connery's temper was veiled in charisma and myth, the next man on the list wore his authority like armor, refined, theatrical, and absolutely unforgiving when crossed. Enter Laurence Olivier. 7. Laurence Olivier. Laurence Olivier didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He could command an entire room into terrified silence with a single disappointed glance. Where others stormed and shouted, Olivier reigned cold, exacting, and utterly convinced of his own artistic superiority. His version of a bad temper wasn't wild chaos. It was iron discipline sharpened into something cruelly exact. To call Olivier difficult would be like calling the ocean moody. He was a titan of 20th century performance, worshipped by critics and feared by colleagues. Biographers often describe his on-set demeanor as militaristic, especially during rehearsals. He did not tolerate mistakes. He did not entertain weakness. If you flubbed a line or missed your mark, the reaction wasn't rage. Exactly, it was disdain. Quiet, withering, and devastating. He could be especially hard on younger actors, not in a theatrical sense, but in the way a headmaster might dismantle a student in front of the class. The subtext was always the same: you're lucky to even be here. Behind the scenes, some called him tyrannical. Others used words like imperial. Either way, the message was clear: you served the production, and Olivier was the production. And yet, people kept signing up to work with him, because for every soul he eviscerated in rehearsal, he delivered a performance that left audiences breathless. The camera adored him. The stage obeyed him. His Hamlet redefined the role for a generation. His Richard III slithered with menace. Even late in life, he could command scenes with little more than posture and breath control. The industry treated his severity as a kind of necessary evil. In the mid-century hierarchy of British theatre and film, authority flowed from the top, and Olivier was the top. He wasn't expected to be kind. He was expected to be brilliant. And brilliance, they said, required discipline, especially from everyone else. Still, as the decades shifted and softer leadership styles emerged, Olivier's old-school rigidity began to feel dated. Admirable, yes, but also a relic. A monument to a time when cruelty could wear a cravat and call itself standards. But not every difficult British actor hid behind refinement. Some preferred the dagger in plain sight, sharpened, glittering, and usually followed by a cutting one-liner. Enter Kenneth Williams. 8. Kenneth Williams. Kenneth Williams didn't throw tantrums. He wrote them, in diary form. Every cutting remark, every petty feud, every perceived slight, it's all there, scribbled with theatrical venom in one of the most brutally honest personal journals ever kept by a British entertainer. If Laurence Olivier ruled from a throne, Williams flailed from a swivel chair, acidic, insecure, and perpetually furious at the world around him. He was best known for his work in the Carry-On films, low budget, high camp, and wildly successful. But behind the double entendres and exaggerated facial expressions was a man constantly seething. With colleagues, with the audience, with the very industry that made him famous. His diaries paint a picture of someone who saw nearly everyone around him as either incompetent or unbearable, and sometimes both. Co-stars learned to walk on eggshells. He could be wildly charming at lunch and openly hostile by tea time. Small frustrations, a missed cue, a bad line reading could send him spiraling into days of sulking. And while he rarely blew up in public, the tension he created was palpable. Directors often said they had to manage not just his performance, but his mood. Each production was a balancing act between keeping him engaged and keeping him from exploding inward. But Kenneth wasn't a monster. He was an anxious perfectionist in a system that rarely rewarded emotional nuance. His anger wasn't about power, it was about lack of it, lack of control, lack of respect, lack of appreciation. He knew he was brilliant, and he also knew he wasn't taken seriously. That knowledge didn't simmer quietly, it calcified into bitterness. And yet, that same bitterness made him unforgettable. He was lightning fast on panel shows, ferociously witty on radio, and capable of conjuring huge laughs with a single arched eyebrow. Even his cruelty had flair. He could insult someone and leave them laughing until they realized what he'd actually said. But if Williams was a storm cloud in a comedy costume, the next figure on our list turned temper into televised theater, not a slow boil or an emotional diary, but a full-on Dynasty-era diva war zone. And yes, it was Joan Collins. 9. Joan Collins. Joan Collins didn't need to raise her voice to make a scene feel hostile. She simply had to walk in late, in full makeup, and pointedly not acknowledge you. Her temper wasn't volcanic. It was strategic. Delivered with eyeliner, diamonds, and the threat of a headline. Where most actors simmered or snapped, Joan turned her fury into a weaponized form of glamour, one eyebrow twitch away from a tabloid war. Throughout the 1980s, Collins didn't just star in Dynasty, she was Dynasty, and she knew it. She played Alexis Carrington like she was born for the role, because in many ways, she was. Calculating, poised, ferocious, in a designer gown. The drama wasn't just on screen. Behind the scenes, feuds with co-stars became as much a part of the show's draw as its actual scripts. But here's the twist. Collins rarely denied it. In interviews, she'd smile, sip her tea, and offer a quote just sharp enough to sting but vague enough to deny. She called it professionalism. Others called it sabotage. Reports of on-set clashes, usually with other actresses, swirled through the press. Crew members whispered about diva demands, rewrites, retakes, and entire days lost to image negotiations. And every time, the story ended the same way. Joan walked out looking untouched. It wasn't just about vanity. It was about control. Joan had been through the Hollywood machine in the 50 seconds, chewed up and almost forgotten before her comeback. When she returned to fame, she did it on her terms, and anyone who tried to cross her found themselves frozen out or publicly rebuked. And yet, she was always magnetic. Even those who clashed with her admitted she could light up a scene. Her temper wasn't self-destruction, it was brand maintenance. If a producer got bruised along the way, that was just business. In a world where tantrums are forgiven but assertiveness is punished, Collins blurred the line so thoroughly that no one could tell which was which, and she liked it that way. But while Joan sparred with co-stars and camera angles, the next name on our list fought something even more unyielding, the very idea of playing nice. Which brings us to Glenda Jackson. 10. Glenda Jackson. Glenda Jackson didn't throw tantrums. She dismissed the premise of tantrums. For her, the idea of playing the game, smiling for the press, deferring to producers, tiptoeing around fragile egos, was not only insulting, it was intellectually beneath her. And she made sure everyone knew it. In the late 1960s and 70s, Jackson was the thinking person's movie star, a performer who radiated integrity, intelligence, and an unyielding refusal to entertain nonsense. Directors called her difficult, but it wasn't because she missed cues or caused chaos on set. It was because she argued back, forcefully, repeatedly, often in full view of the cast and crew. Her interviews were famously spiky. When journalists tried to get a soundbite about romance or beauty, they got lectures about art, class, or political hypocrisy. And when studio heads tried to market her as glamorous, she recoiled. Jackson had no interest in being charming. She wanted to be correct. That was the power move. And her refusal to suffer fools, even powerful ones, created an aura of danger that followed her onto every set. Actors respected her. Crews treaded lightly. Producers sometimes hated her, but no one denied her brilliance. Films like Women in Love and A Touch of Class showcased a talent that couldn't be smoothed over or made palatable. Jackson brought an edge to every role, an intensity that made even her silences feel confrontational. If a scene didn't work, she'd say so. If a director tried to rush her, she'd stop the day cold. If a line felt false, she'd demand a rewrite and usually get it. And yet, Jackson wasn't cruel. She was principled. Her temperament wasn't rooted in ego or insecurity, but in an unwavering standard of excellence. Unfortunately, for everyone around her, that standard was often impossible to meet. Later in life, she left acting altogether and entered politics, and by all accounts, she brought the same unsparing intensity to Parliament. Glenda Jackson never melted down. She refused to melt at all. But if Jackson's fire was controlled and cold, the next figure burned from the inside out, a star whose volatility was less about power and more about pain. Her name was Rachel Roberts. 11. Rachel Roberts. Rachel Roberts was the kind of actress who could dominate a scene with just a glance, a Welsh-born force of nature who brought volcanic intensity to every role she touched. But off-screen, that same intensity became something far more combustible. Roberts didn't merely have a temper, she seemed to live inside one, the kind that didn't need provocation, just proximity. In the 1960s and 70 seconds, she was one of the most respected dramatic talents in Britain. Her performances in This Sporting Life and Saturday Night and Sunday Morning weren't just good, they were fierce, raw, and unsettlingly human. She had a gift for portraying women on the brink, balancing tenderness with fury, vulnerability with absolute command. But as her career soared, so did the rumors that Roberts wasn't just playing intense. She was intense, always, relentlessly. Accounts from friends, colleagues, and biographers paint a portrait of someone in constant battle with herself, with the industry, with the people closest to her. Her legendary relationship with Rex Harrison, whom we've already met on this very list, was an operatic saga of passion, public drama, and backstage eruptions. It's hard to say who fueled who, but together they created one of the most tempestuous couplings in mid-century British film. And once that marriage unraveled, Roberts's reputation only became more volatile. The industry, predictably, didn't know what to do with her. Studios liked their stars fierce on screen, not in the makeup chair. And Roberts made no effort to hide her moods, her frustrations, or her contempt for what she saw as a shallow, controlling system. She was too real, too raw, too unwilling to play nice. Directors admired her work, but many were hesitant to work with her again. Stories of sudden outbursts, abandoned takes, and stormy rehearsals trickled through casting rooms. And while some of that anger was theatrical, some of it was symptomatic of pressures unspoken, of wounds unhealed, and of an industry that had little room for emotional transparency unless it could be monetized. Roberts didn't go quietly. She raged, and the echo of that rage still lingers in the way she's remembered, not as a cautionary tale, but as someone whose fire outlasted the frame. But for all her volatility, Roberts still had moments of grace. The next name on our list, however, was less forgiving, a man whose intensity came wrapped in quiet stares, clipped tones, and a private life full of shadows. Meet Trevor Howard. 12. Trevor Howard. Trevor Howard always looked composed. Even when the character he was playing was unraveling, Howard himself seemed steady, controlled, contained, proper. His performance in Brief Encounter became iconic precisely because of that restraint. A man torn apart by feeling, but too British to let it spill out. But beneath that polished surface, Howard's real-life temperament was a lot more stormy. He didn't scream, he didn't slap, he didn't throw furniture. What he did do was seethe in long silences, in sudden refusals, in unpredictable shutdowns that turned working with him into a delicate negotiation. Co-stars spoke of him with reverence and caution. He was a consummate professional, until suddenly he wasn't. And when that switch flipped, everyone on set could feel it. Biographical accounts describe Howard as a man fiercely protective of his privacy, which is a polite way of saying he didn't like being told what to do, even by directors. He could be stubborn to the point of sabotage. If he disliked a script note or found a line beneath him, he'd simply ignore it. If he felt a production wasn't worth his time, he'd radiate contempt until everyone agreed with him. And when questioned, he didn't explain, he vanished behind a wall of polite, frosty detachment. There were whispers, too, that his temper wasn't just about pride, but about something darker, personal demons, private dependencies, and a growing disillusionment with the industry that once adored him. His off-screen life was often as enigmatic as his characters, and some claimed he preferred it that way. Stories of behind-the-scenes clashes are hard to pin down, mostly because no one wanted to speak on record. But the tension was there, woven into interviews, memoirs, and those awkward production pauses no one wanted to talk about. Still, directors kept casting him, because even when he was at his most difficult, Howard delivered. His on-screen gravitas was unmatched. His ability to convey doubt, disappointment, or slow-burning rage with just a glance made him unforgettable. He was the gentleman actor who wouldn't be managed, the brooding presence who made everyone nervous not because he was loud, but because he might leave, or worse, stay and make it unbearable. But while Howard's discontent festered in shadows, the final name on our list made misery into an art form elegant, bitter, and biting to the last word. George Sanders. 13. George Sanders. George Sanders didn't shout. He didn't throw drinks or storm off sets or get into tabloid brawls. That sort of behavior would have been far too obvious and far too tedious for someone of Sanders's carefully cultivated disdain. No, Sanders preferred to destroy people with elegance, a raised eyebrow, a lazily sharpened insult, a pause just long enough to make you question your own relevance. If temper is a form of violence, his was linguistic and impeccably dressed. On screen, he specialized in playing cynical aristocrats, suave villains, and world-weary sophisticates. Off-screen, he blurred the line between role and reality. Co-stars, directors, and journalists alike would all come to the same conclusion. George Sanders hated being there. Not the job, necessarily just the people, the business. The pretense of it all. He viewed Hollywood as a vulgar pageant and the industry's rituals as a farce. And unlike many stars, he didn't try to hide that opinion. In fact, he seemed to enjoy broadcasting it. The thing about Sanders's temper was that it didn't erupt, it lingered. It hung in the air like expensive smoke. He wouldn't yell at you. He'd sigh in your direction and say something like, "Well, that was regrettably uninspired," and then walk away before you could figure out if he meant the lighting or your entire career. He made being insufferable look like high art, and for years, the industry tolerated it, even celebrated it, because what else would you expect from George Sanders? He once received a Sour Apple Award from the Hollywood Press Corps, specifically recognizing his difficult, caustic behavior. He accepted it without irony, possibly with a toast. Colleagues often described him as unreachable, not emotionally volatile like some of his peers, but deeply and immovably uninterested in playing by anyone's rules but his own. There was no yelling because there was no pretending. Sanders simply did not care if you liked him. And that's what made him so fascinating. He wasn't hiding his temper, he'd simply turned it into a brand. A lacquered surface of sarcasm, underpinned by real contempt, delivered with such smoothness that people mistook it for charm. In the end, George Sanders didn't burn bridges, he watched them collapse with faint amusement, already moving on. Which, in some ways, makes him the perfect closing chapter for this list. A man who didn't just have a temper, he made it fashionable.